Guests. So welcome everyone. Well, today we have a very well-known face who saved us from a last-minute, dropout. It is my pleasure to introduce you, Dr. Dawn Holford. For those who do not know her, Dawn is Senior Research Associate within the School of Psychological Science here in Bristol. She's a behavioral psychologist, mostly, with a particular interest in the relationship between linguistic information and cognitive processes. I believe today's talk is mostly about that. What are the linguistic features associated with anti-vaccination argumentation and how those relate with psychological constructs? But I leave it to you, Dawn. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Fabio. It's a very good opportunity for those of us in this project to get some feedback because we're trying to write it up. And basically, I'm going to be sharing with you like a wealth of data we've collected on people's explanations for why they don't want to have vaccines in their own words. And we're trying to like make sense of this data and map it to psychological concepts. So I'll jump right in with just sharing with you where the departure point for this study came from. So I know some of you have been in my previous talks about the attitude roots of vaccine hesitancy, but this kind of stems from this paper, which is I think way back in 2017 now, that seems so long ago, where Matthew Hornsey and Kelly Fielding talk about this concept called attitude roots that are motivating people to reject science. And I think that paragraph kind of sums it up. The reason why we can't just cite evidence at people and expect that they'll change their mind, because there are underlying psychological factors like fears, ideologies, worldviews, identity needs, and these sustain and motivate the attitudes that people are expressing. So what you hear, and in areas like climate skepticism, creationism, it's not just anti-vaccination, and we hear this attitude against these scientific constructs, but it's what's lying underneath the surface on the sort of psychology of the person that's helping them to keep holding on to these attitudes even in the face of evidence. And so in the context of vaccination, in some previous work, we studied this and we looked at how expressed reasons like those that are on the screen, which are another set that actually is this, I don't know, we've collected a lot of anti-vaccination arguments. So I can't remember whether this is actually from our set right now. But basically, these tend to cluster in certain patterns, and we can assign them linguistically to a root. For example, on the left, we say those are arguments to do with fear and phobias because they're about the fear of suffering adverse medical consequences from vaccines. Whereas on the right, you've got one that's very much about conspiracist ideation. So this idea that someone's up to something. And so we think of these, we sort of conceptualize these expressed attitudes, these linguistic statements people make as being motivated by an attitude root that goes below the surface and is really part of the sort of internal workings of the person. And so in that previous research, we looked at 11 different attitude roots that we found through systematic reviews of the literature and also analyzing social media. And so I won't go through all of those in detail because that would take quite a while. But the main thing to be aware of here is that people hold underlying motivations for their attitudes, which we call attitude roots. And they ought to be identifiable in the way people express their attitudes. So we call these linguistic expressions. I may also use the term self-expression as I talk through this. And so in a previous paper looking into this, where we collected these reasons that had been reported in past research and also sort of tweeted on social media and were basically misleading claims that were fact-checked, we did a sort of analysis that tried to use machine learning to predict whether these linguistic features were distinct. And so on the left, you're sort of seeing a visualization, a 3D visualization of the distinctiveness of these attitude roots mapped to the various anti-vaccination arguments. And to sort of test whether that's actually a valid sort of prediction, we sort of randomly swapped labels and you can see what happens there. It's just a mess. So there's actually specific features around the argumentation that allows us to classify linguistic expressions into attitude roots. Now, the tricky part here is when we try and then align that to the psychological factors that a person holds. So we'll call these for now psychological constructs, just to put a good label on it. And since the theoretical basis we're working from is that people's motivations, people's attitude roots should motivate their expression of certain arguments, we tried to study this by saying, okay, well, we'll get people to endorse arguments. We'll give them some arguments and see what they agree with. And then we expected, well, people who are more conspiracists, they should maybe endorse the conspiracist arguments more, but maybe less so the fears ones, or less they'll be less religious and so on. But that wasn't what we found. So when we did that study, this web thing you see on the right is basically the sort of profiles of people who endorse all the different arguments. And what you can see, there's 3 concentric circles that kind of basically show 3 different profiles. The pink one are people who just reject vaccines. So their level of negativity towards vaccines is really high. But they just endorse everything. So we thought they would we were, or at least we were hoping to find that they would sort of distinctly endorse some anti-vaccination arguments, but not others. But no, it was just pretty much everything goes. And then you see sort of the middle group, and you see the green group, which is people who are sort of positive towards vaccines, who don't really endorse everything, except there's a little bit of religiosity there, interestingly. But the main thing here is that if people are motivated to hold a certain, like even if the attitude root motivates people to hold their specific attitude against vaccines, it can actually even motivate people to endorse any sort of statements that's aligning with that overall negative attitude, whether or not it relates to the root. So you show people something, they look at it, it's anti-vax. Okay, I'm very anti-vax. I'll endorse it. It doesn't actually help us get at what that underlying root really is. So this leads us to think that, well, if we want to actually find any associations between what people express, we may need them to actually self-express their argumentation and not just give them things to rate. And so that brings us to the study that we've done now, where we're trying to link people's own expressions to psychological construct measures that we gather from surveys with them. So I'm now going to explain that study a bit. So basically, the data we have is 556 text explanations, each gathered from an individual who is from the US. We recruited via Prolific, and this was over the period of December 2022 to January 2023. So this is why this has been going. We've been analyzing this for a while. And so we picked participants who had been pre-screened in Prolific for having only negative or neutral COVID-19 vaccination views. And that's the political profile of it. You'll notice that it's very overrepresented by Republicans. Now, we tried very hard to quota sample and get fewer, get equal amounts, but then this actually, I think it's just the fact that there's a very distinct political split in the US over those people who are negative about COVID-19 vaccination. So stay upfront that we know they are leaning towards republicanism, but we can't really do much about that just because it's really hard to recruit Democrats who have those views. So that's our participant sample. And so how do we actually get this data? So we started by asking, oh, sorry, is there a question? I can't see anyone's faces.
No, actually, no, there's no question.
Sorry. So yeah, if you do have a question, just shout, because my Zoom screen has completely disappeared. Okay, so right, yes, so people basically we started by asking them first, well, how do you feel about vaccinations? And that's the next exact screenshot that they will see. And so let's say somebody says, okay, I'm negative. Then the next thing they do is go to this box where we pipe that answer, that negative, it appears in that bold text there. So whatever they put, we will end up there. And this allows us to kind of weed out people who, for some reason, in their pre-screener said they're negative, but then here they tell us, oh yeah, actually I'm all for vaccines. There were some. So we asked them to explain why they feel that way. And we sort of incentivized it by saying, okay, we'll give you, if we get highly detailed responses, we'll give you bonus payments. And there was sort of payment rate we used for that. And it sort of worked. I think we got like, the word count was sort of between 200 to 400, and it was more than previous times when we'd asked people to give explanations of stuff. So it was a decent incentive. So basically, so what we did with those texts was that we had a little team that first looked through the text, and we tried to pick out different individual argumentation units. So if you look at the text there, that's an example that someone's given, and we try and like code it to say, okay, what is an individual argument? Because one thing you notice about the text is that they give very nice detailed expressions, which is lovely from a text analysis point of view. However, you realize that there's all these different units of argumentation, and you can't, it's really hard to break down and just say, okay, we'll analyze it statement by statement, because people's punctuation sucks. People use run-on lines. People don't necessarily structure these in a sensible way. So we had to come up with some kind of criteria to split it, to say, okay, how do we isolate different units so that we can reasonably code these elements of argumentation? So we first did a segmentation exercise, and then so we pulled out all of these, and we had several rounds of reliability checks, just going through and making sure we were applying the rules consistently. And then once we had those argumentation units, we could then code each one of them to say, okay, what attitude root is this expressing? So as an example, you can see that first statement, they've been very forced and mandated. Well, that's a clear sign of reactance, which is this pushback against signs that people are trying to restrict your autonomy. And then the other argumentation unit we identified there, many vaccinations have been rushed out without having studies done on the proper long-term results. We coded that as distrust of the vaccination, so not trusting the process had been done properly. So that's what we did with the text. Now, in addition to the text, after people had provided those explanations, we gave them a sort of battery of questionnaires. And so this always came after the text, because we did not want to influence what people would spontaneously write. So there were 12 modules here, and all of these modules were randomized in terms of the order that they were presented. So just each one would just get a random order of all of these. So I will skip to the ones at the bottom first. So those are basically 11 psychometric scales, and each of them was selected to represent one of the 11 attitude roots that we'd identified. So you can see we had conspiracist mentality, distrust, and so on and so forth. There's 11 of them there. I'm pretty sure, I hope I didn't accidentally forget one. And I won't go through every single one of them, but just as a, I'll give some examples of them. We limited it to 3 items each, just because this is a very long, it would otherwise be a very long questionnaire, and we don't really have that much money to pay people to do half-hour studies. So we did we had previous data where we could identify, okay, which 3 items are most indicative for that scale. And then, of course, we have to check the reliability and everything afterwards. But basically, this is the conspiracist mentality questionnaire we use. I think it's Bruder and Bruder, if I'm not wrong, the reference. And then here's another one, which was the epistemic belief scale. And I think this one is quite well known to a lot of people in this group. It's the Garrett and Weeks scale. And we just use one subscale, which was the truth is political subscale. And that's this idea that people believe that because truth is dictated by whoever is powerful, it's a very subjective, relativistic conception of what's a fact and what is true. So those are the questionnaires. And you'll notice I said 12 modules, and the last one here, also in the mix, was basically an argument endorsement scale with a question about familiarity. So we had 11 different anti-vaccination arguments, each one representing or picked to best represent the attitude root it belongs to, or it's basically a prototypical argument expressing that root. And then we asked them, please rate how much you agree with this. So this is basically replicating previous research where we just got people to endorse arguments, and we wanted to see if we're going to find the same thing, where people just who are not who are against vaccines just agree with everything that's also against vaccines. But then we also asked an additional question, which was, have you read the statement or one similar to it before we showed it to you here? And so that was just kind of to get at the idea that people might endorse things even if they haven't seen it before. So that's one thing we were interested to know about. Okay, so this might be very quick in that I'm already at the results. So what we find, so let's look at these endorsements first that I've just spoken about. So that's just sort of the mean levels of these endorsements, which is actually quite similar to what we find. And all you can tell from that is that, well, they're not all endorsed to the same amount. And that's something we consistently find as well. People agree more in general with some than others. But the internal consistency of the endorsements of all of these is a 0.88 alpha. So Cronbach's alpha is pretty high. And so what we find with this is that, well, if people endorse one argument, they're also tending to endorse the rest at a higher level than other people. So that internal sort of correlations between endorsements of these arguments is very high. Now, the next thing is what was people's familiarity with these arguments? And so you can see that there's a very different pattern here. So this is the proportion of people who said, yes, I've seen this one before. And it doesn't necessarily correspond with how much people endorse it. So we couldn't really find that there was a consistent correlation between how much people endorse arguments and how familiar with the arguments they were. I think for conspiracist ideation, yeah, it was there, but then for others, it was sort of not, it was a bit all over the place. So what we do see here is that participants do endorse things that are new to them, that they may not have seen before. And this is important because if they don't know it, they would not have expressed it themselves. So you know in that header, I called it the vortex of argument endorsements. I can't take credit for that term. It's one of Steve's, but I really like this idea that there's this whirlwind where you just sort of fall into it. And what's actually motivating that whirlwind when you actually try and analyze it further and link it to all these different psychological construct measures we collected, is that you find there's this one single predictor that is responsible for everything. So we did some multiple linear regressions. So I'm showing you here in this table a summary of 11 different linear regressions we ran. So each regression would be run on a different argument endorsements from a different attribute. So in that first line there, for conspiracist ideation, we basically tried to predict whether someone would endorse a conspiracist ideation argument using all of the psychological construct measures we had collected. So there's 11 psychological construct measures. We enter them all into the regression and we try and predict how high people would rate the conspiracist ideation argument. So you can see there's 4 significant predictors and the strongest one is risk distortion. Then we repeat that for distrust. Again, it's risk distortion. We repeat it for unwarranted beliefs. You get the pattern. Basically, everything is disappearing into that vortex of risk distortion as the person's the individual the best predictor of whether people are going to endorse an anti-vaccination argument, whatever route it is. I mean, with the one exception of religious concerns, which does seem to have a more unique relationship as to whether people are going to endorse that. So basically, up to now, we're just replicating what's been done previously. This is to show that actually it's you can't study this with getting people to rate arguments. People will just endorse everything if they're anti-vax. If they're less so, they'll endorse them less, and so on. Which brings us to what we were really trying to get at, which was what do people then express themselves when you ask them to actually write their reasoning and to sort of explain why it is they think a certain way. So I talked before about how we coded these individual arguments present in the text. And then, of course, we then linked it back into the text to say, okay, does this participant text contain conspiracist argumentation? Does it contain distrust argumentation? Does it contain argumentation about featuring unwarranted beliefs, and so on? So in this graph here, you can see basically what it is that people are expressing. And so the percentages are of each of the texts, are of the 556 texts, sorry. How many of those, or what proportion of those texts contain conspiracist ideation? So the frequencies are not meant to add up to 100 across all of those bars. Think of each bar as, well, if 10% of people have conspiracist ideation, the other 90% don't feature it. So that's how you interpret that. So what we can see from this is that there's actually a lot of imbalance, a lot more imbalance in terms of what people spontaneously express themselves. So their self-expressions will feature some, I mean, here it's quite clear, it almost invariably tends to feature distrust. But unlike the endorsements, they won't just feature everything. So people do converge into some specific routes when you ask them to talk about their attitudes and they express it in their own words. And then, so I've plotted here the word clouds that are for the top 4 most frequent attitude routes. So we've got distrust, fear and phobias, distorted risk perception, and epistemic relativism. So those are the ones who appeared most frequently. And it's quite interesting. Like, you can see there are some patterns in how they overlap. So there's like side effects comes up a lot, both in distrust and fear and phobias. Flu is actually an interesting one that's appeared in distorted risk perception and epistemic relativism. Although I should say straight out, I removed COVID, the word COVID, because people kept referencing COVID, which again was interesting because we never asked them about COVID. We just said, how do you feel about vaccines? Explain why. And a lot of people started talking about COVID. I think it's still there because I didn't remove COVID-19. Maybe I should do that as well. But then there are also some features that are unique. So government comes up a lot when it comes to distrust, research, and of course the word trust itself. Virus is quite prevalent in epistemic relativism, but also things like personally. So from the word clouds, we already get a sense that some of these roots share semantic features, but they each have something that is quite unique to them. And so this made us think, well, if they've got shared features, might some of them be more related than others? Like, and how can we tell? So we brought in our machine learning expert to help with this. Basically, what we tried to do here was we trained a machine learning classifier. I think it was DistillBERT, for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing. I think Ezekiel, our machine learning expert, is about to come onto the call soon, so I can clarify if you've got any questions about the machine learning aspects, he will be here. So we trained this classifier to predict what route each argumentation unit would be assigned to. So on the bottom there, you sort of see, okay, this is the predictions the classifier makes, and the true roots is what were they actually classified as when we did the coding exercise. And so you can see that, so we did this basically not to try and create very powerful predictions or be able to use a machine to tell with great accuracy what route a person has. The purpose of this was really to see, well, what is the machine confusing for which routes are being confused for each other. And so we see that there are some patterns here, like reactance and worldview politic routes tend to be quite confused. So is conspiracist ideation and distrust. And then there's, so basically all of the sort of slightly darker blue things that are not in the diagonal are showing some levels of confusion, and the I can't remember what the numbers mean exactly, but I think it's the proportion that's correctly classified or into that category. So based on this, we sort of identified 4 different groups that we could sort of that tended to have similar levels of confusion through these patterns. And we found that once we did that, the sort of prediction rate So that's a diagonal. You see a nice dark blue line there, which shows that once you then group the roots, they become less confused for each other. There's still a little bit of overlap, which just shows that there's still some linguistic similarities across different groups, but less so than when you're trying to identify each one individually. So that's a sort of exploration of, well, what do these self-expressions look like linguistically? What's their semantics? How do they relate to one another? But what obviously we've been quite interested in is to say, well, how do they actually relate to the psychological constructs? Because that's the thing we couldn't really get at with the argument endorsements. So we basically did our regression again. So if you remember, I talked about the linear regressions we ran with the argument endorsements. Now we ran 11 logistic regressions. So logistic because it's a binary, whether a text contains a root or not is a 0-1 binary. So we did a logistic regression on that, trying to predict the presence or the expression of argumentation with a certain attitude root in the self-expression, using all the psychological constructs. Now, I'm going to only show you 8 attitude roots. And the reason for that is because if you recall from the slide where I showed the distribution, I should have mentioned it there, but some of them virtually don't exist in the self-expression. So it becomes really hard to do an analysis because there's just not enough data. So we've omitted those 3. And we're looking now at the 8 for which we do have sufficient data to focus on. So what I'm going to show you are odds ratios for each of those regressions. And I'm going to show you the targets. So if you think about it, the self-expression on the right, that's the dependent variable to see, like whether we are predicting the expression of, how do I word this? Basically, whether conspiracist ideation comes up in people's self-expression. So does the text express conspiracist ideation? And on the left, we're looking at the target predictor. So that's conspiracy mentality, where you think, okay, well, if someone's higher in conspiracy mentality, the probability that they have conspiracist ideation in their text should also be higher. And so you can see that it's the target target predictor, it's significant, and it's colored red to show that it's also the strongest predictor among all the 11 in the model. So I'm not going to show all 11 because that's then I'll have 121 to explain. But so I'm just only going to show you the target one and also the strongest one. So the second example here is for distrust. So here we're trying to predict expressions of distrust. And so you can see here we've got the black general distrust, and you can see it doesn't really predict distrust. But the strongest predictor in that model was actually populist attitude, although it wasn't significant. So it's actually very hard to predict this expression of distrust. I sense that it's probably something to do with the fact that it's there in 80% of the text. So it's not a very good, it's really hard to discriminate if something is always there and underlyingly present. Okay, so maybe pause here to say any questions about what I'm showing you, because it's about to get more complicated with dots for each of the 11 attitude roots. Are we okay with this? Okay, so I don't hear anything, so I think that's all right. Okay, so I'm going to show you now the rest of the pairs. So we can see there's a box, there are 8 boxes on each side, each one corresponding to a regression for that attitude root. I'll show you that one first because it's also an interesting one where the strongest predictor is actually this truth is political concept. And we find that interesting because actually truth is political is the target for epistemic relativism. We selected it on the basis that's from the epistemic belief scale. And it's basically this relativistic conception of truth subject to political maneuvering, basically. And so it's very interesting for us that actually I know it's not significant, but it's sort of predicting worldview and politics. So it's interesting that that's come up as the strongest one in that model. So we found that for 3 of so conspiracist ideation, fear and phobias, and distorted risk perception, we got the matching predictor that was the strongest and significant predictor of expression of that expression. So basically, people high in general medical anxiety, that's the strongest predictor of whether they're going to express a fear and phobias root. Basically, that's how you interpret that. And these are the corresponding ones for everything else. So I colored in purple things that are the strongest construct predictor, but they're not the target one. Similarly, nothing going on here for epistemic relativism. That one was pretty hard to predict. And reactance, interestingly, we had truth as political predicting that one more as well. So if you remember from the previous slide, basically I showed you that matrix where we grouped roots according to their similar linguistic features. And so we thought, well, what if we do that here and we try a regression where we just try and predict that grouping, because we know they overlap so much. So maybe we should be looking at the groupings, and that might be a little bit more targeted. So that's what we did in the second regression. And so we had 4 different groups. We had distrust and conspiracy, we had fear and phobias, we had a sort of anti-scientific cluster, and we had a politicized cluster, which is basically, this one is made up of reactants and worldview and politics. And so you see here that truth is political, that epistemic belief skill, which is nevertheless a very political conception of truth, is the best predictor of whether someone is going to express a politicized argument. And then we've got this, so these are the other groups. We've got next a cluster of anti-scientific argumentation, which basically covers this epistemic relativism concept, whether people are going to express argumentation to do with the relativity of truth, arguments to do with distortion of risk, and arguments to do with unwarranted beliefs, the beliefs that are not backed up in science. And what we see here is that risk distortion is most strongly predicting that entire cluster. Fear we kept separate because it was coming up as very identifiable. And so, of course, we get the same result as before. It's very strongly predicted by general levels of medical anxiety. And here's the interesting part, because we had a very strong relationship between conspiracist mentality and the expression of conspiracist ideation arguments. But it kind of disappears when you group it all together with distrust. And what I suspect is that you're then sort of, I don't know, and because conspiracy is such a specific, I think, instance of distrust, where you kind of have to be distrustful to get to being conspiracist, but then that's a sort of necessary but not sufficient condition where you can be distrustful but not necessarily conspiracist. So I think that's what we're seeing here when you group those two in particular. Also, this, like I said, distrust is appearing everywhere. So what we're probably doing there is introducing quite a bit of noise. And then the last thing I'm going to share in terms of the results is how people actually tend to use different argumentations together. And this is something we did this analysis called a latent cluster analysis. And basically what it does is that it groups participants according to similar patterns in how they are expressing their argumentation to explain their attitudes. And so basically the question here is, well, which attitude roots are appearing in people's text? And if you recall, we did this process earlier on where we split the text into argumentation units, coded them, and then of course we applied those codes back to the text now to see, okay, well, which combinations are appearing. So what I'm going to show you in the next slide is this sort of visual map of which combinations tend to appear in higher levels. So that's the analysis where we find, okay, so we've got 3 different groups here, and these groups all tend to express very similar combinations of attitude roots. So you see, for example, the red group, we call that this anti-scientific argumentation group. They tend to be expressing more distortion in risk perception and unwarranted beliefs, and also more epistemic sort of relativism, so the relativity of knowledge and truth and facts. Whereas you have a yellow group that's kind of distinguished by being higher in levels of fear and phobias. And we've got a very reactant and distrustful blue group that also expresses more political argumentation. So you can see this is actually quite similar to the 4 groups we found before. It's just that distrust is kind of spread all over everywhere in this case. And then we map this to the average level of the psychological constructs, those 8 constructs, for those 3 clusters. So basically we took, okay, red group, what's your level of risk distortion? Blue group, what's your level of reactance? You know, for all of those that I'm showing you there. And what we see here is that it's actually quite a good mapping. It's not perfect, but it's quite consistent with what they are, the things that they tend to express within their text in the same text. Now, the one thing that stands out is, again, that sort of truth is political construct, which basically I think has to do with the fact, like, it's maybe a weakness of our item selection there, because we picked a scale that was, yes, it was relativistic, but it was also highly political. So I guess it makes a lot of sense that politicized people who are a bit more politicized are going to score higher on that particular subscale. And I think this exercise for us is quite neat because it allowed us to also identify some other features of those clusters according to like what's their social demographics, for example. So our red group was actually the most negative about vaccination. And that maybe explains why when they are actually endorsing arguments, everything disappears into that vortex of risk distortion, because that's the group that's most likely to endorse everything bad about vaccines. The sort of blue reactant group tended to be younger than the others. There are also more men in this group relative to women. And then the yellow group, which was the fear and distrust group, it tended to be relatively older than the other 2. There were more women relative to men, and they had the least negative vaccine attitudes, interestingly. So yeah, I mean, that was just an exercise we did to see, well, what practical things can we take away in terms of identifying these different groups who express patterns of arguments. So to conclude, it's really hard to distinguish what's at the root of someone's attitudes by just giving them things to endorse. They might just endorse them, or whether or not they've seen them before or really believe in them. We're finding more distinct argumentation from the self-expressions. But even then, we still find a lot of overlap because just the argumentation itself, just the wording, they share linguistic features between different attitude roots. And also when people craft their whole explanations, when you get a nice detailed explanation for people, they're not just banging on from one root, they actually draw from multiple ones. But what's interesting for us is that finally, what we managed to do what we couldn't before, which is to actually try and predict using the psychological constructs what type of arguments people might express. So we're very good at predicting, or we're pretty good at predicting certain groups. And when you look at how people express things together, there's a very nice mapping that that was the last clustering diagram I showed you, where the expression of arguments map to the mean levels of those constructs pretty well. So yeah, that's kind of where this research is at. Right, I'm gonna try and see if I can see everyone else again. Yeah, that's the end of it. I would love to hear what you think about this, because we're right now in this process of trying to craft a paper from it, and that's our current narrative, but we'd like to know whether it's convincing, whether it makes sense, whether there's any gaps in it. So yeah, basically hit us with what you think.
Thank you very much, Dawn. That was indeed interesting. So I'd say let's open we already have a question by Constance. Just keep in mind that Dawn has to leave at the top of the hour. So Constance, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dawn. I was really looking forward to hearing about this project. I was really curious to see, and it's really interesting. So I just have a thought to add in regards to this truth is political issue. So the moment that you presented it, when you said like we have this construct that we ask people, I was not sure. I would put myself in the shoes of the participant, and I was saying, what would I ask? Like, how would I answer this question? And I was not sure whether the question was normative or descriptive. So I was not sure if the question says, do you think that truth is political by definition a priori, because this is how it is. So this is like the epistemic relativism that you're saying, like that this is how things are in reality, and this is how this is how nature is. Or if it's some kind of a critical descriptive question, where I say truth is political because this is how they have created reality now, right? So everything is now distorted because the truth has lost its meaning. And so I think that the reason why it taps on different kind of constructs there is because people can interpret this question in different ways.
I mean, that's an interesting point. Like, so the way that people responded to this was sort of like a Likert scale agreement with the statements presented. And it's one that I don't think has actually been discussed in that original paper that created and validated the scale. It's quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess I sort of assume that it's one of those things where people are agreeing to, do you think that, like, do I think that facts are just dictated by those who are in power? I'm not sure it actually then goes on to point at the this is how things are. Like, I think that's the point I'm a little less clear on. It's a very philosophical question. I don't know if Angela wants to jump in with any comments on that.
Yeah, I understand that. You mean if they are expressing their deep epistemological understanding of the nature of truth, or if they are, for instance, criticizing fact-checking agencies, right? Like what they call facts by this fact-checking agency is dictated by those in power, right? Yeah, I think there's an ambiguity in the items. I was also thinking that we desperately need maybe a more sophisticated scale on epistemic relativism, because we are using Garrett and Weeks scale a lot, but it was like an ad hoc scale developed for that specific paper. It's not like a very ambitious model. So yeah, maybe someone have some money, call me. We can do it.
Yeah, but I definitely see that this, like, when you sort of look in retrospect, you're like, yeah, okay, we are asking them a very political question. It obviously makes sense that relates to politicized argumentation. So, you know, that's something you see in hindsight and you go, ah, damn. Yes, Steve.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Great presentation, as always. Now, can you go to the last slide or second to last, your clusters? That's, I think, I want to work backwards.
The one of the social demographics or just the clusters?
Just the club back, I think. Yes. Okay, that's really cool, and the overlap is striking, I think, between the left and the right. The fact that the constructs give you the same clusters as the self-expression. And just to make sure I understand, you do the cluster analysis on the self-expression and then look up what happens in the constructs, or is it the other way around?
So you do the cluster on the self-expression, like on what's coded there, like, oh, do they express this or not? And then once you've got the clusters, you look at, okay, so for, like, because everyone gets assigned a cluster, so we know, like, maybe participant 1 is red, participant 2 is yellow, participant 3 is blue. So then you have a sort of like a group for that each participant, and then you can say, so everyone in group red, what's your level of risk distortion? What's your mean level of risk? Yeah, exactly. That's how it's done.
But so the clusters are formed on the self-expression.
Yes.
And what we see on the right is sort of the collateral fallout from that.
Yes.
Now, just for fun, what if you did it the other way around? Would it make a difference? In other words, run the cluster analysis on the constructs and then see what the self-expression looks like. Is Is there any reason to prefer one over the other, or you have any thoughts on that?
I would direct this to Angelo, actually, as our guru.
Yeah, we have yeah, we can do it the other way around. We actually have a latent profile analysis in the supplement, but that includes the 11 constructs, not the 8 that are well represented. So maybe we can relaunch it using only 8 and then try the other way around.
Okay. That gets me to my next question, which sort of, yeah, working backwards from this. Okay. Here we have 8, because they're the only ones that were expressed. So we get rid of the other 3, okay? But if you go backwards now to the previous slides, the regressions, okay. Here we now have 4 clusters, in a sense, not clusters, sorry, roots. Politicized, anti-scientific, fear and phobias, distrust and conspiracy lumped together. And the reason we ended up with those 4 is based on the NLP model, right? Indeed, this, which is very convincing to my mind, because that tells us that linguistically these things just, you know, they're impossible to tease apart. Now, my question is, how does the 4 in this matrix and the logistic regressions, how does that mesh with the 8 for the LPA, and why? And we, you know, we start with 11, we go to 4, we're back at 8.
Well, I think we went from 11 to 8 and then to 4. So the 8 and the that 8 stays stable. We always keep with the 8, and then we just look at, okay, so what like we show both of these things. Like I think the 8 are still important, because you can see in the model with 8, like 3 directly predict its matching self-expression.
But
so wait a minute. Hang on. This isn't 11. This is 8.
This is 8. So each gray box is 1.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, then the question is, why do we need the 4? Other than that is what the NLP suggested.
I mean, the real answer is you suggested.
Oh, I know that. I know. And it worked. I mean, quote unquote, in the sense that the machine can tell apart these 4 different groupings very nicely. And we get the 3 out of the 4, the expected predictive relationship. That's wonderful. That's really cool. But then we do the latent clusters and we're back to 8. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the problem here is the sequencing. Maybe we should end up with a 4 and have the cluster analysis earlier on while we still have 8. I don't know. I just worry a little about how the conclusions from the NLP, which gives us 4 different roots, quote unquote, or expressions, self-expressions, how we can reconcile that with the reliance on 8 for the cluster analysis. It's just a sort of a slight inconsistency.
Yeah, both tend to overlap, right? Down the result of the NLP grouping and the LCA were quite similar.
Yeah, I mean, it's also that we're doing it on different units. The 4 is the 4 from the machine learning is based on the individual language in single arguments.
Okay.
As the LCA is based on what people use. And I've just thought of a reason why we actually need to do it that way around. Because we had this discussion before, which is that actually we're trying to predict constructs from what people say. You, in practical terms, you'll never be doing it the other way around. You don't go around giving people psychological questionnaires and go, aha, I'm going to predict what you say. All we have to go on is what they've said to us.
True.
And then we have to try to think, okay, what's motivating them? So from that perspective, the theoretical basis for going from LCA and then measuring what the constructs are is quite clear.
Right, but then shouldn't the regressions also go the other way?
So like using the self-expression to predict. Well, that's a little bit trickier because then so you're basically saying we should enter all of this, how much they self-express, and then I think what we wanted to do there was to see what had the strongest association. And it's quite hard to do just from a statistical point of view if you're using self-expressions to predict the level of psychological constructs.
Yeah, I can see
it's an
that.
analytical problem rather than
No.
anything else.
Yeah, I think the logistic regressions are going to work better than a linear regression using these dichotomicous variables as predictors. Yeah. But anyway, what you said, Steve, is very interesting to try a LCA, the LCA we have now with the labels, and then we run a parallel LPA with the constructs. And if the classes of the LCA and the profiles of the LPA match, and we can calculate the overlap, I mean, if they represent the same subjects, that is super challenging. I mean, it's super demanding, but if that works, will be amazing. But it is very, very demanding. I mean, I wouldn't be worried if that doesn't work because it's crazy.
I take Dawn's point that the reason we do this work, in a sense, is to be able to say, look, we can tell from self-expression what the underlying root is, right? And in the spirit of being able to do that, I think what we're doing now is the right thing to do, which is that we cluster on the self-expression and then we look up their profile in the constructs, and lo and behold, they are very close. So I think that's good. Now, can we make more use of the NLP to do a similar thing? We've only done the NLP to predict what the humans classify as self-expression, right?
The problem with the NLP, and maybe Ezequiel can clarify this, is that we can't assign subjects to each cluster, right?
You mean classifying the whole text, one text, one person, with these four? Yeah, the thing is, a lot of noise is introduced because every text is compound of many arguments, and every argument has multiple roots. So in the end, you have a mass of noise, basically. And I think I tried that already. I mean, we can try to shed some light there again. But yeah, basically that was the problem, that there are many layers in between.
Okay. Yeah. Is it in principle possible to train the NLP model to predict somebody's score on a construct? In other words, so rather than predicting what we think their attitude is based on our own text analysis, which is what the NLP does right now, right? I mean, the ground truth during training is our human classification of the arguments. Now, could you train the machine? Is that right?
Yeah.
That's right. So the question is, would it be possible to train the machine instead on people's construct scores? Is that at all feasible? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So yeah, using the text to predict the construct scores. Yeah, I mean, it would be easier if they were categorical, basically. But yeah, I mean, we can find a way. Yeah, actually, that was in our future to-do list for future stuff we could try. Yeah.
I mean, how? Because then, if you had a model that can do that, if we can validate that here, then you basically have a tool where you can run the text through your model and out pops the person's psychological construct, the profile.
Yeah, I mean, if the performance is good enough, yes, we would have that. Yeah.
Well, maybe all you got to do is predict cluster membership on the, in the LCA or LPA, whatever it is. Because then we also have a stronger link between the LPA and the NLP, because at the moment, the NLP is very interesting in showing the similarity space and how things are difficult to tease apart. But that's all we do with it, which is impressive, but it's not like it would be nice to do more with it, right? Is my
Isn't that like what Adam and Almog did with
So sorry, I'm going to cut in and say that in 1 minute I have to go to a different meeting.
Right, of course. Yeah, thanks.
Continue this discussion, including like more administrative things, like where do we draw the line for the paper and what goes into a future paper, which I know Ezekiel has been planning.
Okay, so maybe, okay, well then we'll say goodbye to Dawn, and maybe.
Thank you very much, though.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Dawn. And maybe, yeah, maybe Ezekiel and Angela and Dawn and I should meet. Yeah, okay, set up a meeting to pick up on those points that I just developed, because, okay, good, let's do that.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah.
Now,
that's a very good idea to try to predict the membership of the cluster analysis using LPA. It's a good idea.
using NLP, using the text model.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because then the text modeling becomes central to the purpose of the paper.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, the text modeling is sort of, it tells us, well, we can't differentiate between these different expressions. So it almost introduces a bit of ambiguity, and not like it doesn't add power.
Yeah. Right now, I guess that the only message that you could get is that even though people show or score in 8 different, let's say, dimensions from the scales, when they speak, they mostly use 4 types of arguments. Basically, that's more or less what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Well,
only message, I think.
That's worth knowing that. Well, it's worth knowing that what humans can do, the machine can't do quite as much. But anyway, let's have a meeting with Dawn and we can do that. The other thing, I think, Simon, weren't you gonna talk about this AI stuff briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. Are we ready to do that now? So
Can do. If I have a few more minutes. My next meeting has been canceled, so I'm still here. And
okay, I mean, it should only take a few minutes. Really, this is just about for those in the team, which I would kind of assume would be everyone at this point, but I'm not sure exactly what people's individual research priorities are. But those of you that are interested in generative AI, which is obviously such a fast-moving area at the moment, and some really big stuff happening all the time. Steve was sent half a dozen or so links for sites that have kind of ongoing news about generative AI. And we thought for the time being, it would be really useful for us to take it in turns around the team to look at those sources every week or so, and just see what's in there and flag anything really interesting in a Discord group. I think it's quite possible that over time we'll realize that of those 6, maybe only 2 or 3 are the really key ones, and we don't need to trawl through all 6. But to start with, I think we should do that and just kind of see where we go with it. I think it could be a really, really useful resource. I mean, it's very much central to what I'm doing and what Luke's doing. So obviously we'll both volunteer to do that. Luke and I have already talked about that. But if anybody else, I mean, it'll be a central resource for everybody, regardless of whether you volunteer. But if you do feel like this is something which you'll be using a lot and you're happy to spend some time on it, what I'm proposing to do is to just put a reminder in the calendar after each team meeting on a Thursday, just for half an hour. That's not to say that you necessarily have to do it during that time, but it's just a prompt. Within that reminder, I'll put down whose turn it is this week to do that. So just kind of putting that out there, really, just so that you're all aware of it existing at some point fairly soon. And also, if anybody wants to stick their hand up either now or subsequently, just give me a shout by email or Discord or whatever, to say that you're happy to be part of the sort of rota system to do that. That would be great.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks, Simon. That would be great. And I'm happy to be part of it. If it's once every 3 or 4 weeks, that's easy. And putting a reminder in the calendar is
sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a big deal. It's just that I read so much and I have so many links and so many fucking different channels to monitor that I'm just dying of this information overload, and I can't do more, right? It's just, there comes a point when it's just too much. And so that's why I was thinking if we can share the load and filter it so that I only, or all of us only have to read the stuff that's really interesting, rather than scanning yet another thing. So yeah, why don't we, anybody who wants to participate in that, please get in touch with Simon. And then Simon, if you don't mind doing hi Mubashir, if we can then do the rostering or whatever, Simon,
Yep.
that'd be great. Yeah.
I think we'll want a fairly high bar on relevance as well. I mean, there's going to be loads of stuff that you kind of think, oh, that's quite interesting. But I think this needs to be get this down to the ones that we all really do want to see.
Exactly. But you're right. It's such a fast-moving field, and it is so important for what we do, and it changes everything for us. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Our deepfake paper is kind of like, we're almost at the tail end of the phenomenon now, given how much
it looks. I mean, that video looks really old-fashioned now. We made it 18 months ago, and it looks like something from the Dark Ages now. That's not to say that the findings aren't still relevant for modern equivalents, but in terms of the technology, things have moved on massively.
And the speed is insane. Yeah, and no one really knows what's going to happen and where this is going, and it's quite fun. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Simon. So everybody get in touch with Simon if you're happy to be signed up, and you can sign me up, Simon. That's fine. Thank you for doing that. And it's probably worth circulating those links. Fabio, if you don't mind, or Simon, you can do it. Send it to the TeDCog group so people know what we're talking about.
Yeah, will do.
Because it's a list of 5 or something, right? And this came from a colleague in psychology. I can't talk today. Psychology, Helio, who's a new staff member, and he, I don't know, he sent this around, and I picked it up, and so yeah. And and this guy is monitoring them every week, but good for him, but I can't. Okay, thank you all. Then let's wrap it up. And yeah, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next week, right? What's on next week? Who's talking? Fabio, remind me.
Leo Scheffer from Tel Aviv University is about democratic backsliding in Israel.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. That'll make, yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, lots to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thank you.